We are in week 3 of a Christmas series that we've entitled Encounters with the King. And we're wrestling through this question, why do some people worship and others don't? And we've been noticing that some people surrounding the birth of Jesus, this 2,000 years ago, some people respond to this encounter with greatness with awe and worship and a transformed life. And others are just kind of in the same encounter, but they're left unaffected. But the reality is what we've been looking at is this is not just a 2,000 year ago issue, it's an issue for us today. How do two kids grow up in the same home, going to church, hearing the same things, and yet one kid responds in following Jesus and one kid responds in going the other direction? How can a husband and wife be together and so committed to one another, and yet maybe the wife is super committed and following Jesus and passionate about him, and the husband's just kind of, I just don't get it. Or maybe even for you in your own heart, you look at your own life and it looks like over the periods of your life, you're just almost two different people. There's seasons where you were just really passionate about following God. And it just seemed like it was the driver of your life. And yet now, maybe you're in a season where it just feels kind of dry. It just feels like it's not clicking anymore. And you're asking, what's the reason I feel distant and cold? Why does this happen? And in short, what we've said is because there's something usually that is blocking the natural process of worship. The natural process. And we've been looking at how worship is a part of this process. It's not just a thing that we do. It's not just something that comes up within us magically or that we summon up on our own and say, yes, I will worship. It's actually a part of a process. It's a response that begins with an encounter with greatness. Whether it's God's truth or God's love or his majesty or just something in his creation that prompts this response. And this encounter stirs this awe, this wonder within us that naturally leads to worship. This outward expression, this vocal expression of how amazing was that, or this life that is transformed. And as human beings, we've learned that we're actually wired for this to take place. That this is a process, it's a domino effect that naturally takes place when we encounter greatness. And we encounter greatness, which leads us to be in awe, which then we worship, and then we're transformed. But sometimes that process gets blocked. Something comes between greatness and awe. And in week 1, we talked about what one of those things is that blocks our worship. And we said in week 1 that sometimes we're seeing, but we're not really seeing. Or we're seeing, but we're not understanding. It's like a spiritual blindness. And the last week, we talked about the idea of distraction. And sometimes we're just too distracted. We have kind of the shiny object syndrome where we're distracted by lesser things and we're missing the main thing. We haven't taken time to really look at God. And today, we're going to introduce a new block I think is really, really powerful and applicable to most of us in the room. And it's familiarity, being almost too familiar with God in a sense. And I think familiarity is difficult because it's unique because it's not inherently bad. In fact, being familiar with someone or something can actually be a good thing. It means you spent time with it or them. It means you know them well. But familiarity is tricky because it has the potential of causing us to lose an appreciation for greatness. Let me illustrate it this way. Our family moved to Southern California 9 years ago, which sounds really crazy to say out loud that we've lived here for 9 years. We moved from the East Coast to North Carolina. But I grew up in Alabama, and I grew up very far from an ocean. Anybody else grow up kind of landlocked, like you are far from an ocean? So for us to go to the beach was a big deal. It's kind of a once a year thing. And as a kid, I absolutely loved it. But when we moved here, and the beach is 25, 30 minutes away, I'm like, man, this is awesome. And by the way, we live in what I think is one of the most beautiful areas in the world. Anybody else feel like that? Like it's an incredibly, ridiculously beautiful area. And I've been here 9 years, but I still drive down the road sometimes and I see as the sun's setting and I see the silhouette of a palm tree on a beautiful sunset. And I'm like, this is amazing. Anybody else do that? Like, come on, like this is amazing. I drive down to Laguna Beach and I just drive down the road, the Pacific Coast Highway and look over the cliffs in Laguna Beach. And I'm just going, God, you showed out down here. Like, good work, great job. This is unreal. Now drive back at maybe this time of year, maybe as we get on into January, February from the beach, which how amazing is it that you can go to the beach in the wintertime, okay? Like that's amazing. But come back from the beach and driving down the 55 from Newport, headed back this way, and you look up, anybody notice when you see the mountains and you see snow on top of the mountains? Does that just get anybody? Like, whoa, I just left the beach. We just got through surfing and my kids were playing in the sand and there's snow right there. And you just go like, wow, it's amazing. It's beautiful. But here's something that can tend to happen over time. And for some of you who have lived here all of your life, you know this because I've been describing this and you've been going, what's the big deal? It's just palm trees. It's just a beach. It's just a mountain with snow on the top. And here's what happens. Over time, there's a tendency for the beautiful and amazing things to just fade into the background and become normal, right? And you ride down the road, beautiful sunset, and you just miss it. Or you don't even see the snow-capped mountains. They just blend into the blur of the traffic and everything else. Because over time, familiarity has a tendency to dull our ability to be in awe of what's around us. You become too familiar with it. And the same thing can happen in our relationship with God. For some of you, you're like, man, this isn't my first rodeo. I've been doing this church thing. I've been around Jesus for a long time. And you know the songs. You know the stories. You know the church things that we do. And you get in this rhythm over time where sometimes they lose their impact. And it's not that you stop believing, but it's just that those things stop stirring your heart like they once did. And maybe that's you today. And you're asking questions like, why doesn't my heart respond to God like it used to? Why does my faith feel routine instead of like a relationship? And why does worship feel like a duty instead of a delight? And what we're exploring, and that's what we're exploring today. We're asking the question, does familiarity have to become a barrier to worship? Is it inevitable that the longer you walk with Jesus, the less amazing it feels? Or could it actually lead to something greater, something deeper, more awe-inspiring than you actually imagine or know? And that's what we're doing today. And the goal is, if you're like, Pastor, yeah, it's really become pretty dull, if I'm being honest. The goal is not to shame you. That rarely works, right? Let me shame you into it being dull so that you try harder. That's not what we're going after. We're looking at, okay, can we explore this and see what that block is and remove it and allow God to rejuvenate our hearts and our relationships with him again. That's where we're going. And so to answer that, we're going to turn to the Christmas story that we've been exploring. We're going to look at Matthew chapter 2, 1 through 6. Really familiar, but I want you to look at this familiar story with new and fresh eyes today, okay? Let me set the stage for you just a moment before we read it. It takes place a couple years after the birth of Jesus. By this time, Mary and Joseph are no longer in a stable. They're living life in Bethlehem. The scriptures tell us in a second that they're in a home, which, by the way, if you're thinking about the nativity scene that you see in the Christmas plays every year, it's going to blow your mind when you realize that all didn't take place in the stable, all right? Some of it did, but the wise men actually came 2 years later, okay? Sorry to disrupt Christmas for you, but that's the way it took place. And so about 5 miles away from Bethlehem, where they're living, is Jerusalem. And a group of visitors arrive from the east. These wise men, magi, who are astrologers. And they've traveled hundreds of miles following a star that they believe signals the birth of a great king. And their arrival stirs up all kinds of questions, mainly for the king Herod. Let's read it in verse 1. It says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, 'Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and we've come to worship him.' And when Herod the king heard this, he's troubled, and all of Jerusalem with him. And they assemble all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, and he inquired of them, where's the Christ, where the Christ was to be born? And they told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it's written by the prophet. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." So when the wise men arrived in Jerusalem, they're asking the question, where's he who is born King of the Jews? And Herod doesn't know the answer. He doesn't know the prophecy of where the Messiah is going to come from. So he turns to the religious experts, the chief priests and the scribes. Now, the scribes were the scholars, the theologians of their day. They knew the prophecies backwards and forwards. They dedicated their life to the study of God's word. And the chief priests were the spiritual leaders of Israel. They oversaw the temple. They represented the people before God. And of all the people in the world at this time, these people are the most familiar with God and his word. And when they're asked where the Messiah would be born, they didn't even have to look it up. They knew it from memory, and they said he'll be born in Bethlehem. After hearing the prophecy of where the Messiah would be born, the wise men do what you'd think they would do. Thank you for telling us. Let's go 5 miles down the road to actually meet this Messiah that we believe has been born. And they go there and they're rewarded by finding Mary and Joseph and Jesus as a baby, the Son of God, in this house at this time. And they bow down and they worship and they give gold and frankincense and myrrh. Now, typically, when we're looking at this story, we focus on this group of the wise men, right? And usually, as a pastor, we'd say something cheesy like wise men still worship him. Get it? We're going to try to steer away from that today. But they are kind of the main characters of this story, this real life event that took place. But what I want us to do is not focus on the wise men who actually went and followed through to see the Messiah, but there's a group of people here who are incredibly familiar with God, familiar with the scriptures, and they don't respond in worship. And it's the scribes and the chief priests. Again, of all the people that you would expect to go and to worship, it would be them. They've been studying this all their life. The prophecy, the Old Testament, hundreds of prophecies predicting the coming of the Messiah. And it's happening in their lifetime. And they won't even entertain the thought of leaving where they are, walking 5 miles down the road and going to check out and see if it's true. To put it in perspective, it is basically the distance from where we are to the Irvine Spectrum Shopping Center. You guys know where that's at? Okay? And someone comes in today and says, hey, the Messiah that we've been looking for has been born, and he's at the Irvine Spectrum. And you think most of us would be like, it's kind of a busy day. I don't know if I got time. It's the most important event in the history of the world. And yet these guys, for whatever reason, probably because they're so familiar and they're so close that they're not enamored anymore, they're not in awe anymore, they don't go down and even look. Their familiarity with God actually blocked their ability to worship. And in the same way, it can happen to us. And I think there are two things that familiarity can do to us that become a barrier to worship. The first one is that familiarity dulls our sense of awe. There's a recent study in a journal called Frontiers in Psychology, and it said it this way. Repeated exposure to the same stimuli diminishes all because the need for cognitive accommodation, the mental adjustment required to process new experiences, is reduced. Everybody get that? In layman's terms, the more you encounter something, the more familiar you become with it, with the greatness of it, and the less awe you experience. It's basically the law of diminishing returns. That is, every time you encounter this greatness, it continues to go down again and again and again. And familiarity has the potential to do that same thing in our relationship with God. The longer we follow Jesus, the more potential there is that we grow stale and that we grow stagnant. We hear a testimony of a new believer, which, by the way, I love being around people who are new to following Jesus. I just had the opportunity these last a couple months in our Alpha course to be around some people who are new believers. And I love their excitement because things are fresh and they're still in that place of like, I can't believe that God would forgive me for what I've done. Like, I can't believe that he would adopt me into his family, call me a son, put his name on me and say that he's mine. Forgive me, wash away my sins, adopt me into the family of God and give me the promise of eternity with him. Are you kidding me? And there's a freshness that just comes with being around people who are new to the faith, right? I highly recommend it. But for some of us, even with that, we kind of have this attitude of like, oh yeah, that's nice. Just give them some time. It'll fade away, right? And that's kind of our mantra. It's this idea of you're just destined to go through this. They're just going to get less and less over time. And we get to the point we're just not really excited about anything that the God of the universe does. Familiarity dulls our sense of awe. But the second thing familiarity can do is familiarity can foster pride. And here's what I mean by that. Familiarity can cause us to believe that we've seen all there is to see and we've learned all there is to learn about God. The scriptures talk about this idea that knowledge has a way of puffing up in pride and arrogance. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying knowledge is bad. I'm not saying stop reading your Bibles. Don't learn more. That's not what I'm saying. But sometimes when people learn more, there's this arrogance of, I don't need to learn anymore. I really think one of the most dangerous Christians is the person who thinks they've learned it all. They know the Greek backwards and forwards, and they can explain to you, and they can parse out the participles and the moods and the tense and the voice and all of these things. And I'm like, that's fantastic, but do you love Jesus? Like, let's just be real. Do you love Jesus? Do you follow Jesus? Are you obedient to him? Are you still blown away by the God that you see in scripture and you can see evident in nature and who's working in your life? There's a difference, but familiarity can lead to pride, just like it did for the scribes and the priest who were puffed up. Pride whispers, you don't need to go deeper. You already arrived. There's nothing left to explore. And when we get there, we experience a closed mind and a hardened heart that's not open to the idea that there may be more of God to experience. A.W. Tozer said it this way: to become too familiar with holy things is to lose a sense of awe and deep reverence. Familiarity breeds contempt only when it's mixed with pride and self-sufficiency. So this dull sense of awe and this pride that comes from familiarity become, as you can easily see, a barrier to worship. And at this point, you may be thinking, well, this is a real downer of a sermon because it sounds like this is kind of what we're doomed to do and be as we continue to go throughout life. And you may be thinking, well, I think this is just how it works. When you get familiar with something, awe automatically decreases, wonder decreases. The longer you follow Jesus, the less excited about him that you are. And you're thinking, maybe that's just a part of life. And what I want to do today is stand here and just respond and say, no, absolutely not. It does not have to be that way. In fact, that's not the way that God intended, for you to get more familiar with him and for your awe and wonder of him to diminish over time. I don't believe that following Jesus is a life of diminishing returns. In fact, I think, again, if you go back to the scriptures and you look at the people surrounding the birth of Jesus, what we see is the opposite is true. The chief priests and the scribes may have been indifferent to the birth of Jesus, but there are so many other people who were so familiar with God and so familiar with the scriptures who had the opposite effect. We've talked about Simeon, the old man at the temple who had waited all of his life for it. We talked about Anna, who was the prophetess there the same day at the temple again, who had been in the rhythm of worshiping and prayer and scripture study and all these things all of her life, and she worships God. Zechariah, and on we could go. Years later in their life, believers for decades, incredibly familiar with God, but their familiarity is not a barrier to worship. Instead, it was a bridge, not a barrier, but a bridge to lead them deeper into wonder and worship and transformation. You guys still with me today? Okay, we're making the turn. We're coming home, all right? Familiarity doesn't have to be a barrier. It can be a bridge. It can be a bridge that leads us into deeper, more profound worship, a deeper relationship with God. And I want to spend the last few minutes we have explaining how. So how does familiarity become a bridge instead of a barrier? And it's not automatic. It doesn't happen by accident. But I believe there's a way for it to draw us closer to God rather than pushing us away. And it starts with a shift, a new way of approaching something that is familiar. I want to give you 2 steps here, okay? 2 shifts. Number 1, step 1 is humility. Humility, recognizing that there's more to see. How many of you understand that before you can be open to growth in anything, humility is that first step? You ever tried to coach or teach somebody something that didn't need to be taught? You're absolutely wasting your time, aren't you? Because if they know it all, if they've experienced it all, you can add nothing to them. If they think that they know everything there is to know about what you're trying to teach them, then they are closed off to progress. They are closed off to there being more. The door has been shut because there's no humility there. And that's where it has to start with us. If you're like, man, I'm just spiritually dry, it has to start with humility. It's about admitting something crucial, that you have not arrived. Not arrived. No matter how much we learn or how long we've been in church or how deeply we think we know God, there is always more. God is infinite. His greatness, his love, his wisdom, they're beyond measure. And Paul writes about this in Romans 11 and verse 33. He says, "Oh, the depth of the riches of the wisdom and the knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and his paths beyond tracing out." Paul wrote that, by the way, also known as probably the greatest Christian who ever lived, probably knew more about the scriptures than we could ever learn in 10 lifetimes. And Paul writes about him and he says, the depths of God are absolutely unsearchable. You can never get to the bottom of who he is. The psalmist David wrote this in Psalm 145:3. He says, "Great is the Lord and greatly to be praised, and his greatness is unsearchable." I love what John Piper has said in recent days along those same lines. He says, God is infinite, and therefore the joy of knowing him is inexhaustible. It increases forever. Which, by the way, I think one of the great things about being in eternity in heaven with God, obviously better than the alternative, but one of the great things about it is that we will never get to the bottom of who God is. And I know some of you have thought about that, because I've thought about that. Like, am I going to get bored up there? You know, it's like year 500. Like, that's about it, you know. I don't know, what do we do from here? But the reality is, because God will never hit the bottom of who God is, it'll constantly be an unveiling of more of this eternal, infinite God that for eternity will constantly be saying, wow, can you believe that? I didn't know he could do that. It's this bottomless pit of who God is. And humility allows us to admit that we don't know it all. And there's so much more of God to experience. Step 2 is exploration. Leaning into God's depths. So when I'm humble enough to admit that I haven't discovered everything about God, then that opens the door, the possibility for me to begin to explore the many layers of who he is. Again, the Apostle Paul, I think, captures this beautifully in Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 18 and 19. He says, and may you have the power to understand as all God's people should, how wide, how long, how high, how deep his love is. And may you experience the love of Christ, though it is too great to understand fully. Then you will be made complete with all the fullness of life and the power that comes from God. And here's what Paul is saying in a nutshell. He says, let me just take one area of God, one facet of who he is, and that is his love. And I just pray that you would understand how wide and how deep and how tall it is. And then he comes back and says, and by the way, you can't, but I hope you spend a lifetime trying to discover it and realizing it, that you can't get to the bottom of it. And he says, and that's just one area of who he is. There's no boundary that you can reach. There's invitations to go deeper. And here's what happens is you go deeper with God. You don't reach an end. You don't reach a wall and say, that's it. You reach new levels and fresh encounters with God who are going, I've never seen that before about him. And new moments of wonder and worship. That's what happened with the wise men. They didn't stop in Jerusalem and say, oh, well, these guys have figured it out. They seem to be dull and bored with everything that's taking place. Maybe we should just stay here. No, they continued to press in. They pressed in further and continued to explore. And they were rewarded by finding the Messiah right there in a house. They were able to see him, to bow down and worship because they didn't stop. They didn't assume that they had seen all there was to see. They pressed in. In the early 20th century, most archaeologists believed that this area in Egypt called the Valley of the Kings had given up all the secrets that it could give up. That they had found every tomb there was to find. They had discovered every ancient king there was to discover. Decades of exploration had yielded treasures beyond imagination, and experts were convinced there is nothing left to uncover. Many even declared that further digging was a waste of time. But there was one man that would not accept that conclusion. His name was Howard Carter. He was a British archaeologist, and he felt differently. He had studied the records meticulously, and something didn't sit right with him. He was convinced that there was another tomb, one treasure that had been overlooked. It was the tomb of a little-known pharaoh named Tutankhamun. Anybody remember him? Carter, in his quest to find this tomb, faced years of rejection and funding challenges. Many of his peers mocked his persistence, but he kept digging. For 6 long years, he searched the valley, finding absolutely nothing. His sponsor, a very wealthy Lord Carnarvon, grew impatient and almost withdrew his support. But Carter pleaded for one more year of funding. Something convinced him he's on the edge of something extraordinary. And in November of 1922, just as time and money was running out, his team uncovered the steps, a set of steps that were leading to a sealed doorway. And when the door was finally opened and Carter peeks inside by candlelight, his eyes slowly adjust. He's stunned at what he sees. He sees gold glimmering in every direction that he looks. If you're like me and you grew up in the 90s, I'm thinking DuckTales all day long, okay? Let me just put that in perspective, right? DuckTales, maybe National Treasure for some of you, like this is what's happening in real life, okay? He sees statues, chariots, jewelry, weapons, perfectly preserved. As he explores this room, this ancient tomb of King Tut, he makes another discovery. This isn't all there is. This is just the first room. And he finds out there's another room, and another room, and another room. And it keeps going from chamber to chamber to chamber. Each one filled with treasures, more magnificent than the last. King Tut's burial chamber alone was filled with artifacts worth over $26 million. I love this story because I think it reflects our journey with God. I think for a lot of us, we've just been around it for so many times, we've assumed there's nothing left to discover. It's what Dallas Willard called presumed familiarity. It's the idea that I'm too familiar for there to be anything else. And he said, presumed familiarity is actually pride and ignorance combined together. Because when we think that way, we stop searching. We stop looking. We assume that we've seen all there is to see. And yet, if instead of stopping and allowing pride to fill our hearts, if we'll say, wow, what I found on the surface about God is amazing. What if there's more? And we continue to lean in and we continue to be open to the fact that God wants to show us more of who he is and reveal himself to us, then we open up ourselves to continue to find that there's more levels of God. There's more layers to God. And just like Mr. Carter continued to open room after room after room, that's what our life becomes. Not a place of arriving, but a place of continually opening up new doors to who God is. And here's what happens, okay? And I don't care if you've been saved for 5 years or 20 years or 80 years, but here's what happens. When you continue to encounter God in that way in your life, with every single new discovery, every single part of his word that you've never noticed about him before, every prayer that he answers in your life or a friend's life, every time you know that he's patient with you and cares for you and you encounter something new about God, it brings you back to a new place of awe, of wonder. It makes you want to keep pressing in. And that awe and that wonder leads to worship and transformation. And just like Carter continued to find room after room after room, that continues to be a cycle of you just spiraling deeper into God over the course of your life. And today, I just want to ask you, where are you? Where would you say you are in your relationship with God today? Maybe for some of you, you're like, Pastor, just be honest. I've just been kind of dry lately. That's okay. It happens to all of us. But I would encourage you, take some time this week and really lean in. Maybe for the first time in a long time, you open up his word again. Say, God, speak to me fresh and new. Maybe you just put everything away and you sit down and you just pour out your heart to him. You sit down with a close friend and just confess. And you pray together that God would just begin to show you new things about who he is. But I want to encourage you, don't let your familiarity be a barrier to worship. Let it be a bridge. You continue to go, God, deeper and deeper over the course of your life.